Hello, Cynthia. Today is Monday, November 23rd, 2020. My name is Paula Levine-Kuhn, and I'm interviewing Cynthia Jasso for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Cynthia, that this interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin. If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there is something you want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. And 3 of these questions, basically you have to answer yes, or we can't do the interview. Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation that you give us. By the way, we would love to get photographs at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. So the first question is, do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
I agree.
Second question, do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
I agree.
Number 3, do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Like YouTube or?
Yeah, they actually do put it on YouTube.
Okay.
So
sorry.
The reason they do this is so that it's scholars and people at other universities can look at it. If you just Google, they don't, and I'll keep reading because they don't post any personal information that could help someone find you, like your address, etc., or phone number. So if you want to just Google Voces on YouTube, you can see what it looks like, Cynthia.
Sorry, I thought it was just going to be the archive.
No, I understand. You got to know what you're getting into.
Yeah. It's got like.
So it basically has the person's name and generally what they do. And I am not the one that does that. Voces employee, uploads it and synthesizes what you say.
I'm like a very private person. You probably already noticed that. Oh, I clicked on a video. Even like when we did the New York Times article, the Yes Magazine, I was like, can I just send written responses? So I am a little slightly uncomfortable by it being that widely available since I don't have the questions or I'm not really sure what we're going to discuss.
Well, keep in mind that anything you don't want to discuss, you just say, I don't want to talk about that. But generally, we'll be talking about, your upbringing, what's made you into the person you are today, your work with your employer, what college it was like for you. I mean, the point of Voces is to let people understand the Latino experience.
I'll do it. I'll agree, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia.
Yeah.
Okay, we have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voces server. Before we send it to the Benson, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members. So that will not be part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. And trust me, there aren't that many people at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file available to research at the Benson? And I'm asking you because it says, on occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact or interview subjects. Voces is part of the journalism department at UT Austin. So they are well qualified to know who's a legitimate journalism person. But if someone wanted to write a story, for example, on the, how Latinos cope during the pandemic, they might want to call you and talk to you. But, and then it says, we only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone number or your email with journalists? You would never have to even talk to them if they called you. And
I'd rather not. Well, if that's all right.
Okay, that's fine. And that's the end of the form.
Okay.
So I get an A for remembering to do that at the beginning of the interview.
Gold star.
Okay. So we're going to go back to your infancy, basically, and talk about growing up. Maybe you could just share some of the memories about growing up and, your family and where you were and your memories. So take it away, Cynthia.
I grew up in a small town called Banning, California. And I always tell folks that I grew up in a small town because I think when people hear California, they think of Los Angeles or these big cities. And Banning had 5 streetlights and 1 big main street and some smaller side streets. But I grew up in a small trailer park. I lived there all my life. And I think some of my earliest memories really had to do with celebrating my culture, my identity, whether it was going to different festivals or church events, and really just being able to celebrate that my family was from Nayarit, Mexico, and that we were proud of that identity. So I grew up there, and one of the things that was always really important for me as I grew up was knowing that I was a Latina and that my parents also were immigrants, and they had come to this country 30 years, it's almost about 30 years at this point. And so that just that identity and being able to celebrate and truly be myself has been some of the fondest memories that I have of me growing up, whether it was going to Mexico or it was, dressing up as a cora at church or whatever it may be. I think those are some of the things that just I always remember from my childhood.
So where in Mexico did you go back to?
I would go to Nayarit, Mexico, which is a state on the west coast of Mexico, right off the coastline.
Was it tropical there? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was very hot, very humid, lots of mosquitoes. Definitely not what I was used to coming from California.
How long ago did your parents come to, how did they get to California?
So they migrated, both my parents crossed the border undocumented, and it's been about 30 years at this point since they made their journey here.
And so you grew up bilingual?
Yes, I grew up bilingual, English and Spanish, and in school, was at first started off as a English language learner and then tested out. So at school, I wasn't in formal bilingual classes, but at home we only spoke Spanish.
And how did your parents influence your life besides giving you roots in Mexico?
Yeah, they were really influential in my life for a lot of reasons. I think they taught me the value of perseverance, of unconditional love, and I think, hope and optimism. I saw my mom and dad they're both hard workers. I mean, my mom, she'd wake up at 2 in the morning and wake my brother and I up so we could go to my aunt's house so she could take care of us. And my dad, same thing. He was working as a groundskeeper. And so I think they both instilled values of hard work from an early age in my life. And they also taught me how to value all types of work, right? Whether you're working at a produce factory, right, or you're a doctor, hard work was just so important. And I think their identity as immigrants, and specifically as undocumented immigrants, and having a mixed status family was a constant reminder of the American dream and kind of that hope and possibility, but also some of the deep challenges that existed in our country to make that a reality.
Were you a translator for your parents a lot when you were growing up?
Yes, I interpreted a lot. I definitely learned a lot of medical terms from an early age, whether it was at a doctor's visit or at the bank or even at my school. I translated and interpreted it very often. So I sometimes joke that, you know, in some ways that experience was really one of the reasons why I wanted to go to college and why I wanted to go as far as I possibly could go in my education, because in some ways they exposed me to that, right? To have these conversations with a doctor or at the bank. But at the same time, on the other side of that coin, I think you know, it was hard for my family when they couldn't communicate with my teacher and, you know, with the doctor. And so as a kid, even though it was a really good experience, now that I look back on it, I think as a kid, I was sometimes not always the one that would say, yes, I'll go do it. I kind of would say it as a, all right, I guess I'll go type of attitude. But yes, I translated pretty often.
And tell me about your siblings.
Yeah, so I have 2 brothers, and I have a brother who is a year younger than me, and he is in philanthropy, just like I am. Is also graduated with his bachelor's and has an MBA, and incredibly talented, incredibly smart, and I would argue a lot funnier than I am. But I would say that I'm totally not as funny as he is. And then my younger brother, there's an age gap between him and I, about 15, 16 years. And so he's 11 years old right now and into video games and a complete teenager. But he brings a lot of life to our lives. And then I have 2 half sisters. Both of my half sisters live in Mexico, and they're my dad's children from previous relationships and marriages. And so I was able to get to know them as a kid. I would visit them when I was in Mexico. And I think it was always, you know, I always wanted a bigger sister, or just, you know, sister, since I did grow up just with me and my brother for most of our lives, and then my youngest brother. But yes, so they stay really close in contact with them. And, you know, I'm now an aunt on both sides for both of my sisters. And so get to hang out with my nieces and nephews.
So do you go back to Mexico much now?
So pre-pandemic, when I was in high school, I would go like every other year or so. And then when I got to college, I took like maybe a 5-year gap or something like that between my last visit, and I just went a year ago with my fiance to Mexico, and we went to Mexico City, to the Pyramid of the Sun, and then we spent the rest of the time in Nayarit.
So did your parents encourage you to become as educated as you became, or instill education as a value in you and your brother?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, everything, since I was a kid, I always remember my mom would say, you know, Cynthia, you know, we're not going to leave you any fancy cars or a house, you know, but the thing that we could leave you is an education. and always supporting you in that process. And they did, whether it was, me going and joining debate club when I was in middle school, or when I was in high school doing volleyball, doing Interact. My parents were always very visible, very present, and always encouraged that for me. And then when I went to college, I think, that was very important for them. I was the first in my family, and for most of my immediate family as well. And so going to college for them, it was like the proudest thing, right? They would tell all their, friends and stuff about how, my daughter went to UCLA, la UCLA. And I think that was, them being able to visit the campus and to see their daughter, and then my brother, who would follow me a year after in the university, I think was, very important for them. So, and it all came back to them. I think they believed in education, even though they themselves had only had a 6th grade education. They knew that it was important, and that it was fundamental for us to not only be successful, but also to be able to advocate for ourselves. And so I think my parents not only instilled it, they encouraged it, and they taught me at an early age that education is one of the things that no one can take from you, right? And that it is a value that you should carry on and continue to just learn as your entire life. And so I definitely owe it to them for being able to pursue my education.
Was it difficult? Did you start kindergarten speaking English? No, you spoke Spanish. So do you have memories of those days?
Yeah, and actually so it's actually really funny that you mentioned that, because the other day I was on my Facebook and I had received a request from the husband of my 1st grade and 2nd grade teacher. She was about to retire, and she was the teacher who taught me how to read. She was the one who really put me in that path. And I remember when I read my first chapter book, she was one of the first people I told and bragged about how I was so proud. It was like a paperback. I still remember, because I was in, I lived in a trailer. It was a 1 bedroom, and then, the kind of kitchen area and the living space, it all kind of blended in. But I was in my mom and dad's room with this little flimsy paperback book. I think there must have been like a moon on the cover page or something like that. And when I finished it, I was so proud. I mean, I told everybody about it. And my teacher at the time, she, made a big hoorah about it. But it was the first book that I had not only read, that was like kind of a chapter book, right? Although now that I look at my books that I read in college, I definitely would not consider it the same. But it was also the book that I read in English. And that was an important milestone for me.
So, and do you remember your playmates from when you were in elementary school?
Yes, I was friends with probably the same group of 4 girls for the entirety of my elementary. They were, one of the things about the school that I grew up in, which I loved, was that it was a very diverse school, not only across lines of race, but across socioeconomic status. And, I did grow up in poverty. And so having friends who, even though they were, middle class or a little bit more affluent than me, but that, would still have me over and still treat me, with a lot of love and care, and my family, it was just so important. So I think having those friends was amazing. And, we got to play basketball, kickball, all the normal things that kids our age would do.
It sounds like you had good memories. Do you need to talk to your boss, Cynthia?
He just texted me, and I just told him to give me a call when he has a chance. He's still on the call, so.
Okay.
But I'll let you know when it happens.
No problem. So, middle school, and so what was your trailer park like? Can you describe it to me?
Yeah, so it was right off of Ramsey Street, which I think earlier I mentioned that Banning was one street, one main street and 5 street lights, all of which I was very proud of because I knew every single street. and for a geographically challenged person, that's very important. And the trailer park that I grew up in was named Webb's Trailer Park, and there were maybe 30 trailers, and it was kind of in a, kind of like a U-shaped, right, where there were trailers in the outside and then kind of in the inside piece. And I grew up in one of those trailers. It was a very old, small trailer. And then, in fact, the only other time I moved in my childhood was to go to the trailer on the other side where I lived, which is a little bit bigger. We had another room, which was nice because at the time I was sleeping in what was our kitchen, our living room, and where our bunk beds were for me and my brother. And so, but I loved living in the trailer park. I loved it because my cousins lived there, and so we would play soccer, although sometimes we would get in trouble. And we just got to, like, everybody there felt like community. We all knew each other. My mom would have our next door neighbor take care of me sometimes, or my aunt who lived across from us. And so I think from an early age, I just felt like I was in a community of people, and kind of this idea that it takes a village to raise a child, right? And I have a lot of fond memories of my time there. I will say though, with that there were moments where I did feel embarrassed. Like I wish that we had a house. I wish we had more space and we had a yard. And I think that was part of just me just understanding like what it meant to grow up in poverty. And even though I did, my parents always had food on the table for us, and I think living in the trailer park was a constant reminder of that we were living in poverty, and we did have to get food stamps, and we did have to go to garage sales, and recently I bought my house, my very first home. I became a homeowner, and I was telling my fiance, I was reflecting on, he was asking me kind of what the design that I wanted to do or wood, whatever. And I was telling him, when I grew up, we just would go to garage sales or the swap meet, the flea market, and we would find furniture there, and that would be it. Like, you didn't find matching, cohesive colors or all that. I didn't grow up like that. And so, so I think growing up in the trailer park was the place where I built community, where I really was myself and truly was taken care of by so many people. And at the same time, it was also a reminder of what it meant to grow up poor, and also, I think, a place that I'll always kind of recognize as very important for my social justice, like activist lens, and the way in which I approach this work in the world, because of what it meant for me, right? To grow up in poverty and to feel sometimes that sense of shame, and to not be able to host sleepovers unless folks wanted to sleep in the living room floor. But it was very important for me in my life. Yeah.
So did your feelings, comparative feelings with other kids in your class, get worse through middle school and high school in terms of money?
I think so, because there were certain things, right? Well, I mean, one thing is like being able to, have sleepovers, but the other things is sometimes, my parents both worked. And so after volleyball practice, sometimes folks would offer me a ride, like my friends, and I would feel uncomfortable. I didn't really, share, hey, well, I live in this trailer park, can you drop me off there? And it took me a while, my most trusted friends, right, that I would feel comfortable sharing that. It just, I think when I look at that time in my life, it's a time in my life where I was having a growing understanding of, like, not only my identity and what it meant to be from a mixed status family, but kind of what are the barriers that Latinos face in this country. And at the same time, it was a time where I really understood why my parents were saying education, and that I had to like keep staying in school and doing that. And but it did over time. I think it evolved. And once I went to the university, I realized actually that is so important, that this was a part of my life, and that I can't forget my roots, and I can't forget what it felt like when the moments where I felt shame or embarrassment, because in actuality, my parents worked so hard for us to have a roof over our head, and we never like struggled with that. And so I think, now I look back and I feel ashamed that I felt shamed, but I also recognize as a teenager, just teenager Cynthia is very different than adult Cynthia.
So you said your father worked doing landscaping work. What did your mother do?
Yeah, so my mom, when I was, I would say probably like in kindergarten, first grade, in that time, she was working at a factory that made car brakes. And then when I got into middle school, she switched jobs into a produce factory where, and it was there in the same town, and she would, they would basically pack up the fruit and the veggies and all of that. And then when I went off to college, she would clean houses. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And so she, after that stopped working.
Is she okay?
Yeah. Yeah. So she battled cancer, and, she's in remission right now. And yeah.
So what was high school like for you?
It was a lot of fun. I remember I was in AVID, which is the Advancement via Individual Determination, which is a college prep program for first generation college students. And the reason I mention it is because we had a cohort of students that had basically the same classes. And so I just had the same classes for 4 years with pretty much the same people. I was pretty outgoing. It took me a while, my freshman year, I was a little bit more on the quieter side, but definitely opened up and, became a part of volleyball and was the homecoming queen for our high school, and just was really engaged as much as I could. And by the time I finished high school, I had been, I had taken all these AP classes and had done really well in my schoolwork, and had been accepted to like 21 colleges, if I still remember, and universities. So I see high school as not only the time where I got to meet some of the most amazing people and some of my friends that I still talk to today, but also just a time where I really broke out of my shell and got clear on, what I wanted to pursue in my life. A little bit clearer, right? 'Cause never can be super clear, but.
So who did you go to homecoming with, and what did you wear?
Well, so our school did, at the time there was the homecoming king and I both went together. And I remember I wore a dress so I didn't own dresses. I wasn't very much a girly girl. I mean, and we went to this place. It was down the street, right across the movie theater. There was this $9.99 clothing shop that would sell everything like $10 and below. And so we bought this like $10 black dress that I wore for the homecoming parade and for the dance. It just was, it was the cheapest thing that we could find. And also, my mom, she would say like, you're only going to wear this one time. But yeah.
So where is Banning? What's the nearest big city? How far from the nearest big city?
Yeah, so Banning is about 80 miles east of Los Angeles. And so about half an hour from Palm Springs, if you're familiar with the desert area of California, but it's in the Inland Empire. So it's kind of in between the desert and then the mountain kind of valley side of California.
And with your parents being undocumented, were there any times where you couldn't go someplace with them or they couldn't come with you?
Yeah, so most of the times when I went to Mexico, I would go with my aunt or my uncles. My parents wouldn't come, and so I think at an early age, I got to realize that family vacations were, it was gonna be myself and my brother, and we'd hang out with my aunts and uncles who were awesome, but my parents couldn't be a part of it. I do remember once, when I was young, really, really young, that we went to, my mom came with us, and I remember can I give you a call back? He's calling me right now, or can we mute it? Okay, all right, thank you. Hi, I'm back. I'm so sorry about that. Hola.
Oh, not a big deal. I'm just making sure we're still recording and everything. Yeah, the technology, it's got to work.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had mentioned earlier your
the vacations.
Oh,
right.
Well, no, I was going to take a different tack.
Let's take a different path.
You had mentioned earlier that your upbringing got you involved in social justice issues. So did that start in high school? Did that start your feeling that you wanted to do something in that realm?
It started in middle school. So in middle school, I vividly remember the May Day rallies that happened back in the early 2000s. And as a middle school student, I remember I was in my math class, and we had, a group of students had said, it was one of the walkout, like some students were walking out at the time. And I remember I just didn't do the pledge. I just stood. And then later on we had something at the quad, which was where right in front of the cafeteria. And that was my first time, I think, attending a rally, even though it was a middle school, totally not organized, and it was about immigration reform. And, it was a deeply personal issue for me. And so it started in middle school, I think, where I started really being able to think about how can I use my voice, right, to stand up for things that I believe in. And then when I went to high school, I was a part of the Chicano Latino Youth Leadership Project, which is an initiative that brings together high school students, usually in their sophomore, junior year, to learn about Chicano history. And during that time, I learned about the Zoot Suit riots. I learned about the East LA blowouts. I remember there were some folks who were actually a part of the East LA blowouts that were there. And it was what I would say, one of the most important times in my life, because not only did I had grown up with this sense of value and pride of being a Latina and being, having my family be from Mexico and visiting Mexico and like feeling like I was, that just was an important part of my identity, right? I wasn't neither Mexican or American, I was hyphenated, right? And so going to that conference when I was in high school was the first time that I had heard of the term Chicano or Chicana. And that ended up becoming very important to the way that I thought about history, the way I thought about learning about myself and my roots. So when I went to UCLA, one of the first things I did was I did join MECHA, which is the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which was a student activist group, and it was really much so rooted in this social political consciousness as Chicanos. And then I ended up taking up Chicano studies as an actual major. I majored in that. It was one of my double majors. I majored in that and political science. So I would say like middle school, high school is when I was really starting to form it, but I didn't really know how to name it until I like got to college and got to really, really learn more about my history and about, so many people besides Cesar Chavez, right? Because I think we hear about Cesar Chavez a lot in our history books. We might have a paragraph or two, but now I was learning about, different people like Gloria Zaldúa and, Marilena Durazo. I was learning about others, Gorky Gonzalez, that had shaped not only Los Angeles, but had shaped kind of the Chicano movement. So, yeah.
So tell me about May Day back in
Yeah.
grade. So what does May Day celebrate, et cetera?
Yeah, so it's like the labor movement. I mean, it's a day to recognize the labor, laborers in our country, but also like labor rights. And I remember at that time that there were protests because I'm trying to remember it all, but there was like some immigration, issue where there were folks that were protesting out in LA and other big cities, and they had May Day rallies. And in my school, Banning is actually in a pretty conservative district. So even though California is over pretty liberal or progressive, Banning was, it's in Riverside County at the heart of kind of more of a conservative place. And 287G, those kind of, very aggressive, secure communities type of policies were in place. And so, the being a part of that protest was part of like me saying, no, like we're not going to stand for this and the way that our families are being treated. Because at the time, I knew like people down the street that were getting deported because from our, local police department and seeing what was happening in other cities, and then seeing what we could do as students was really important.
Did your parents ever almost get deported? I assume they couldn't go back to Mexico because then they couldn't come back, right?
Yeah, they couldn't go to Mexico. Luckily, my parents didn't, I'm not faced a deportation order. There was a time in Banning, I mentioned 287G, where our police department had the agreement with ICE where they would deport folks. And so there was a lot of fear in our community, and actually the trailer park that was a couple blocks from us had been hard hit, where there were, immigration raids happening. And so while my parents were never, officially detained or anything like that, the fear of deportation and knowing so many different people that did get deported from our same community was pretty rampant at the time.
So your activism in college, anything else you want to talk about there? What you participated in or friends you had?
Yeah, I think my activism, I'd probably summarize it as it was definitely more focused on the fee hikes. At the time, UC was wanting to do some fee hikes. The privatization of higher ed is a whole nother conversation. And so definitely participated in that. And, my friends being a part of, I was part of Metro for my freshman year, and then I ended up doing more of the student government work at UCLA. And so, I kind of was really focused more on the UC, just the experiences, UC students and what we were undergoing. And I did maybe less of immigration type of specific protests or rallies, was more, I think, really concerned about our fee hikes.
So paying for college for you, you mentioned the fee hikes, and you said you got some scholarships. Was it difficult for your parents to pay, or did you work, or how did that work? How did you?
Yeah, so that was definitely a concern when I remember as a senior and I got my financial aid package, and they showed the grants, and then they showed like the loans I had available to take. And I remember, and then like the anticipated cost, and nobody in my family had ever gone to college. So I had no idea if like I truly needed the amount that was set in the bottom line. And so I was very fortunate to get several scholarships, from the Dell Scholarship, which was a $20,000 scholarship, to a merit scholarship, which was $12,000 a year. And so I got, access to quite a few of those funds in that way. I think the place that I had the biggest challenge was, there was always kind of this small unmet need that I had. And that's not like personal expenses, but just my housing. So my freshman year, my first quarter, everything was smooth. I had my residence hall, I had my meal plan, I had my tuition paid for. And then I remember midway through my freshman year, I needed like $700 to pay the rest of my residence hall and like meal waiver, or my meals, and they put a hold on my account. And so for a while I was eating ramen noodles and my friends who were gracious enough to sneak out a couple of sides or veggies from the dining hall. But for my parents, when I first moved into college, they gave me $20 and they were like, make this last. And as a first year college student, you go to movies, you go out and you get food, even if you have a dining hall plan. And so very quickly, I knew that I needed to get a job. And thankfully, I had spent the summer at UCLA doing some summer courses before I started my freshman year. And so I was already sort of acquainted to the campus and felt somewhat comfortable and had met some students already. And so I applied for my first job in college. And I mean, there were times where, that was just it. I didn't ask my parents for money. I tried to be as frugal as I could, and quickly moved out of my dorm life and took an apartment because it was cheaper. And at one time in my senior year, I had like 3 jobs going on. I was technically like in student government. That was technically a stipend position. I was getting the university rep role, and then my fellowship with the McNair Scholars Program was like another piece to that. And so I just, for lack of a better word, hustled during my college years to make sure that I didn't need to ask my parents for money, and that I could, just live within whatever means I could of my work study jobs. And I think the only other time I really asked my parents for money was when I got my apartment in LA. You need like an $800 deposit or some wild amount that all 4 of my roommates had to put together. And I still remember that day. I was so tearful when I called my mom because I felt so bad that I was asking for money. When I knew things were like already really tight. And, my parents, they were like, of course, like this is, we want to help, of course, and they sent me the money as, from their savings. But I think all throughout college, it was almost like a mission for me to say, well, what jobs can I take? What can I do to make sure I can, not have to ask my parents for money? And, I have a little brother who's like 2 years old, they need to be taking care of him. And so I worked as hard as I could to just make sure that I could do things like that on my own.
Do you have any particular memories about those jobs you took during college?
Well, when I worked at the law school, I got to print a lot of readings for the law school students. So I got to learn really quickly how many readings I would have to do. And actually at the law school, I got to do research. And so that was really important because I think for a time in college, I thought I wanted to be a professor. And Professor Lepucky, who is the bankruptcy research database, he had asked myself and this other clerk to, just do data entry, and at the time I thought it was the coolest job ever. I'm like, here I am looking at LexisNexis and, looking at bonds and all this. So I think that was definitely one of my most memorable memories. And then my other job, I worked as a Justice Corps representative for an AmeriCorps program that provided self-represented litigants legal information. And so what that role entailed is, you worked out of the downtown courthouse, and that's, I would take the bus and get there, and all day I would spend getting to know families that were going through a divorce or through a child support case or housing law issues. And, I got to hear firsthand what were some of the things that were impacting families, whether it was domestic violence or other things. And I think this idea of legal information, right, for someone who's representing themselves in the courts, and what that means, right, when you're self-represented and can't afford an attorney, and how inequitable that is in our justice system. And so I have vivid memories of just helping specific litigants, right, with their cases, and going back and forth with the attorneys, like, did I do this right? Did I fill this out right? Or doing workshops on, how to start their divorce cases or whatever it may be. So I would say those are probably the two most memorable memories for me.
And do you remember college graduation?
Yes, I had started Teach for America. So I was hired to teach at Sapulpa Public Schools as a math teacher, but I needed to go through a 6-week teacher training institute. And so I actually left UCLA in May. My graduation wasn't until mid-June. And did my finals, the ones I could. I did the papers, I wrote them all while I was doing teacher training. So I was going to sessions during the day and then doing my trainings in the writing my papers and things like that in the evenings. But the reason I mentioned that is because I was already in Oklahoma. That was when I moved. And so I hadn't graduated yet and had been living in Oklahoma. And so I flew back to UCLA for my graduation. I chose to do my graduation only in the Chicano Studies department, even though I had majored in poli-sci. And so I didn't participate in the large graduations. And the reason I made that decision was because the ceremony was in English and Spanish. And so I knew that it was really important for my mom and dad to be able to understand what was going on and to hear. And also they had mariachi. I mean, it was really fun. And they put a baby picture of you up on their PowerPoint and a quote. I mean, it just felt really personalized, and, like I really saw myself, and I think my family could see me instead of me amongst, a group of 1,000 or whatever. And so, yeah, so we attended the graduation. I got a minute to speak and to share, like, just what graduating meant to me. And I cried the whole time. You could not understand what I said at all. So, but I at least got to, thank my parents in my graduation and share with them how much it meant to me for me to be there.
So then tell me about Teach for America.
Yeah, so I did the core. So Teach for America is a national nonprofit that works on educational equity. And so they provide leadership development to those that are interested in educational equity. And so I joined the core my senior year. I applied, I got accepted, and they then ask you, what are your preferences for the region? And I think my parents and everybody thought I was going to choose California. And I put Oklahoma as my number one, which was a big shocker for a lot of people. My fiance was from Oklahoma, and at the time, I knew that I had a conversation with my professor, who was my advisor for my senior thesis. And that conversation made me realize that I did want to, go to another state. I wanted to try something. I wanted to try to live somewhere different. And so anyway, so I got Tulsa, Oklahoma as my placement. And started the Corps with that teacher institute training. I was placed in Sapulpa, which was about 20 minutes outside of Tulsa, the city of Tulsa. And I was one of 4 Corps members placed in Sapulpa, so teachers. And the rest of my Corps, which was about like 200, were in Tulsa. And so out of the 4, I was the only one that lived in Sapulpa. And actually, my fiance graduated from Sapulpa High School, and so I knew some of his teachers, which was always interesting to learn about his strengths and challenges with math. So I got to live there. I got to teach, in that district where, where he had graduated, and just made amazing, friends in that process. And my students were amazing. I taught 6th grade for both years, math, which was my favorite subject. And so I think, made a lot of sense. And yeah, when I reflect on my experience at Teach for America, it was both a very rewarding and challenging experience. For those that are in the education, just in the classroom, it is, as a teacher, knowing that there's so many policies and, from funding to, testing and all these things that impact you and your day-to-day with your students. And I think being able to see how those impacted my kids, but also knowing what my students' lives were like, right? And getting to know them deeply, some of whom had very similar upbringings that I did. And so it was very rewarding in that sense, because I learned a lot from my kids, and I learned a lot about what it meant to be an ally, and what it meant to be an advocate. And it also made me realize that, there was a lot more work that we needed to do in the education landscape for our kids to truly have an equitable education.
So your fiance, you met him at UCLA, I'm guessing? No?
No, I met him in high school. Yes, I met him in high school.
So he moved from Tulsa to Banning?
Yeah, so he lived in, lived in Banning for a while. His family is part of the Morongo Reservation, which is right next to Banning. And so he went to Banning High School, and that's where we met. And
so he's American?
Well, he's adopted, and so he's white, and then his family's Native American.
Wow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so then you went from there to your next job is where you work now?
No, so after I finished the course, so Teach for America is a 2-year commitment. I had been working in my summers in between teaching at Teach for America during their summer institute trainings. So just like I had done the institutes, I was now then working, the institutes later on. And so after working a couple of summers, I ended up applying for a role at Teach for America, and worked full-time for the organization, and led their fundraising and communications efforts, where my main focus was to raise money for the program, and to also think about how do we best share the story of our core members, and the incredible impact that they were making, but also the work that still needed to be done, right? So that's what I got to do. And after that is when I transitioned to the foundation.
And what was the transition like? How did you decide you wanted to change?
I think that for doing development, it's very great work. You get to build relationships with donors. You get to think strategically about what your pipeline would look like and what your campaigns are like. But in some ways, they're removed, right, from the community. You're not necessarily working with kids, you know, or with parents and caregivers. And so I think for me, I realized at the time that I wanted to be closer. I wanted to be more proximate to our community, especially our Latinx community. But I also wanted to stay in education. I wanted to do more work there. And at the time, I learned about the Birthrate strategy for Tulsa. And so I'd heard about the Birthrate strategy for Tulsa, which is most commonly known as BEST, because it is a very long name. And I realized, you know, this is what I'm interested in. I want to know about how we can take organizations that are working across our community, sometimes in silos, but other times collaborating, and you know, coordinate and convene a continuum of supports for our kids, right? So that you're not just going from, you know, nonprofit A, and then maybe as a family you might hear about nonprofit B, right? Like instead that there is this seamless set of supports for you as a family. It makes it easier to navigate, which, you know, you asked me earlier about translations, right, and interpreting. I mean, I just think about the many times where maybe I interpreted one thing one day and then they told us about another service, so then we went to another, you know, a clinic or whatever. Like, and you just the different points of entry, right, that families have to different services. And so so joining BEST, which is a team of the foundation, was really important for me. It was an opportunity to not only get more proximate to the community, but it was also an opportunity to think about a holistic regional investment and support system for our kids, with a focus in the earliest years of a child's development, which we know is very critical for brain development, but also for a child's future. And so I started working as the Associate Director of Community Engagement. And my role pre-pandemic, so I started in January, right before the pandemic, the public health orders started. And so I focus on engaging the community.
What was your first day of work?
Oh, my first day of work, I just went to the office, got my tech set up. My first meeting was a meeting with the Power of Families Project, which is a group of peer educators or promotoras. And so I got to learn about their work, and then did some onboarding, more of the technical pieces to be fully hired. Mm-hmm.
And that was in January of 2020?
Yes.
Oh,
mm-hmm.
So right before.
Yeah. So for the first couple of months, I was just getting to know the lay of the land, and thankfully, I'd been in Tulsa at that time, already more than 5 years. And so I knew folks in the community and, all that. But when the pandemic started, when we started hearing about the pandemic was in December, right? At that time, there were already media outlets talking about it. And I don't think it was until January when, we heard of the first case, in California. And so for me, I just remember, it was March, it was around spring break, maybe right before spring break, where the city of Tulsa put, safety, public health orders in place, the shelter at home. And so from one day to the next, we went from working at the office to working at home. And that was a very surreal experience, right? As a new staff member, now being in a virtual environment. And my team and everybody was awesome. I mean, we tried to figure out different ways to engage with each other and to check in and to do self-care. But yeah, that's what I remember from that time.
At what point did you know that the pandemic was serious?
Well, I mean, I think really early on, I felt like it was really serious. And I think mainly because in California, we were hearing about California and New York, and just even though some of the cases were in North and Central California, it just hit really close to home, right? Knowing that there were COVID cases there. And so I think early on, I just took it really seriously. When I felt it become, when I realized that the impact, right, economic impact, the social impact, was probably when our restaurants started shutting down and folks were starting to get laid off. And I was hearing about that. And then, for me, I remember talking to my mom. I was walking around the apartment building where I used to live, and I was telling my mom, Mom, is my dad's job okay? And he had stopped working too, because they weren't considered an essential business. And so he had stopped working. And as that happened, I remember distinctly that I started thinking about our undocumented community. And, this is very close to home, and being from a mixed status family. And so I was asking a couple people at our foundation, what's going to happen to our immigrant community, right? We know that the federal government is about to give out these stimulus checks, but we know that undocumented folks are not going to receive these benefits, and they're largely excluded from other types of relief. And so that was when the idea of forming the Tulsa Immigrant Relief Fund started. And, from the onset, we knew that whatever money we raised, it had to get out the door quickly, and that we had to be very much so operating in an environment where we're leading with trust and supporting our organizations that are already trusted institutions in our community for our immigrant community. And so I would say in the first couple of weeks, we raised almost $1 million, which was phenomenal, right? When you think about, a purple city in the heart of a red state, to have a group of donors, immigrant advocates, in a very grassroots way say, we're going to raise our hand and we're going to support our immigrant community, and we're going to make this happen. And so we co-founded. So I was one of the co-founders of the Immigrant Relief Fund. We raised $1 million, and right away started forming partnerships with those trusted organizations that were serving our immigrant community. Some of them were doing that before the pandemic, right? You might think of organizations like the YWCA or Catholic Charities who already were doing that work. But then we realized that there were the churches were actually very well positioned to support our community. And so we formed, mini coalition of partners for the Immigrant Relief Fund, and deployed cash assistance. And so we provided up to $1,000 worth of cash assistance that was unrestricted. So folks could use it to pay their medical bills, to pay the rent, whatever it was that they needed most at the time. And to date, we've raised almost $1.5 million at this point, and have served more than 1,400 families in Tulsa. And we still have, more families to go and continue to raise money for it. But I think in all of that process, what I've learned is the importance of trust, and who those trusted messengers in the community are, especially for those that are undocumented. Who do I go to, right? That isn't going to report me, or that I can just, trust that they can have my information, like my address, and they won't, share it with others. So I learned very quickly trust, and the grassroots approach, like how critical it was to include our partners in the design of the distribution of the funds and what the reporting looked like. And so just as a person in philanthropy, really thinking about how do we bring community perspective as we're building out these processes for folks to ensure that they're not cumbersome, to ensure that they treat everybody with dignity and with respect, regardless of what your situation was at the time, right? And so really leading with those values, I think has made the Immigrant Relief Fund, I think, not only successful, but also I think a really good example of how to bring in different community voices to the table when it comes to grant making.
So tell me about the relationship between that fund and your employer. Was your employer paying you to raise the money? I mean, was that part of your job description?
So no, so the Tulsa Immigrant Relief Fund was definitely not part of my job description. My foundation, where I work, we're one of the donors of the fund, but not the only donor. And so I did do this as a private citizen who just happens to have, one of our donors to be the foundation, and then we have, other local foundations and individual donors who also provided support.
And well, that's interesting. Okay, and then during the whole pandemic, what have you been doing at your foundation where you work?
Yeah, so I've been taking on
Give us an overview about what your foundation does first.
Yeah, so the George Kaiser Family Foundation is really focused on breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty. And we do it really with a focus on early childhood and thinking about how do we create a vibrant and inclusive Tulsa. And so that's really our focus areas. I work on the Birthrate strategy for Tulsa team, which is really focused on early childhood. And during the pandemic, I have been really focused on a couple of things. One has been basic needs support. And so very early on, we saw the food lines that were long, right? We knew that people were suffering through food insecurity. And so I helped stand up some food distribution sites in partnership with churches and got those up and running. In addition to that, I worked on doing some type of cash assistance. And so the Immigrant Relief Fund is one form of cash assistance, but we've done, more far-reaching cash assistance efforts that's really targeted to families with young children. And so that's been something that's been very important for me, and that's been an important project that I've been working on at the foundation. And then on top of that, so my role is about shared leadership. And so I work a lot with our community liaisons, who are folks who are trusted messengers in our community, who know, have really deep networks of parents and caregivers that they know. And so we hosted listening sessions to learn about what the gaps were, what were the critical needs our community needed. And then on top of that, we also developed key resources, whether it was like one-pagers or little kits that we could give to families. And so I was a part of that. And then the other role that I've played has been the role of a facilitator and convener. So the Birthrate strategy for Tulsa has over two dozen government agencies and nonprofits that are partners of that network. And so we put together these calls for organization and systems leaders around COVID and approaching it through a racial equity lens, like there are different responses that organizations can take. And so the first call that I facilitated and put together was with the Dr. Bruce Starr, who is the executive director of the Tulsa Health Department, and he talked about the different phases of reopening. And we asked, very critical questions of, how do you think about that through a racial equity lens, right? Who are you asking to come back to work first, and who are you not? Those very key questions. And that series has, we've now done 4 calls, and each of the calls has touched different parts of what an organization leader might be grappling with right now, whether it's reopening, or the last call that we had was around self-care and healing practices for teams, knowing that all of us are processing the pandemic in different ways. And so so those are kind of the ways that I supported. I did basic needs support, played a role in convening different partners and organizations, and then doing community engagement through these listening sessions.
And how does your work make you feel?
I mean, I love my work. I love being able to be in community. And last Friday, we had actually a community listening session over Zoom, and there were 26 people on the call, parents and caregivers. And, you know, I think it is both a reminder of the resilience and the beauty of our community, and also really an opportunity to surface how policies, you know, that are happening at the local and state level, how they're impacting people's day-to-day lives, right? And what those critical gaps in support are. So that's, you know, I love that part of my role, like being able to just be in community, back to what I was sharing earlier. But it also, like, you know, I walk away from those calls realizing, like, what can I do more? What can we do more as a community? How can we show up as allies in this work and walk alongside people during these different moments in time, right? And so I think that I like think it's really rewarding, but it's also really challenging because you're hearing about the stories and the ways in which, you know, people are being impacted. And the only other thing I would mention that I didn't mention that I think is really important for this conversation is myself and a couple others started the Latinx COVID Outreach Committee in partnership with the Tulsa Health Department. And so early on in the pandemic, we realized that Latinos were disproportionately testing positive for COVID in Tulsa County. In Tulsa County, Latinos make up about 14% of the population, and yet almost 22% were testing positive. And so we worked with the health department to provide advice and thought partnership on best ways to outreach to our community. And actually later this week, we're gonna be hosting a Facebook Live, a community conversation around what folks can do to keep themselves and their families safe during Thanksgiving and the holidays. And so it's been really rewarding, I think, to be able to be in a space with folks who want to support our community in whatever way possible, right? And to provide that information, but also to, you know, to be a small part of something bigger, right? And I think that's, you know, if there's anything that I walk away from this pandemic with is just, you know, to know, I don't remember how this quote goes, but it's about, you know, the power of a small group of people. I can't remember the whole quote, but I really think there's a lot of power in our community that exists already, a lot of assets. And so being able to build on that has been really powerful, especially in a time of crisis, a time where folks are scared and fearful about what's going to happen, and also uncertainty. And so being a part of community and working with others to do this work has been, you know, very rewarding, a silver lining in all of this.
So the Kaiser Foundation, in your normal work, what's the ethnic makeup of the people you serve?
Predominantly Black and Brown families with young children, yeah, living in poverty is what I would say.
And what's it like working for a foundation? You're basically giving money away, yeah?
Well, I think our foundation is, you know, philanthropy is truly can be a vehicle for social justice, and you know, working at the foundation, I have been challenged to grow as a leader, but also am part of, you know, a family of folks who really want to support in whatever way we can our community. And part of that is financial resources, and the other part of it is non-financial things, whether it's those trainings or those, you know, collaborations and thought partnership. And so I think that's, you know, I think it's both, you know, both and, right? Being able to think about financial supports, and then the non-financial pieces that are just as important.
So has your work, I mean, on your day-to-day, are you at home on Zoom? Tell me about your day compared to what it was, and what do you think the future will bring as far as changes from COVID?
Yeah, so my day-to-day has definitely changed pre-pandemic. Granted, I was onboarding, but before the pandemic, a typical day might look like, getting to the office at 8, leaving around 5:30, and doing meetings, in-person meetings, and traveling to different sites, visiting new people, thinking about our policy work, doing legislative visits, those kind of things. And now my day to day is, a few feet away from my bed in my little office, which has been sort of convenient as well. I spend most of my day on Zoom. I probably spend a little bit more time. I probably work longer hours, to be totally honest, now, and that's a lot has to do with just the volume of different initiatives and works that we're doing. But it's mostly on Zoom. My day in terms of the types of meetings I have really ranged. I mean, there could be some days like Friday where I had a community listening session, that went into the evening, and other days it could be having conversations with folks in the mayor's office about X initiative, or with the Tulsa Health Department about our outreach committee. And so I think a lot of online collaboration and culture building and just getting to know people, and also advancing work. And there have been some in-person events that we've done. So we hosted a Black and Brown barbecue where we did like a culturally responsive food pantry drive. And so there have been moments like that where I volunteered and have kind of helped coordinate events like that provide distribution. And so it just depends when those events take place, and being there in person with a mask and socially distant, of course, but typically my day is on Zoom.
And how's your personal life changed since COVID came?
I would say I spend a lot more time on WhatsApp and just doing FaceTime or Google Hangouts with my friends. My mom has learned how to do video calls as well, which is a big step, because she was like, I still remember when she first learned how to text, she would send like one big word, because she didn't know how to put spaces in between words. So from that to now video calls and sending me pictures and all that. So definitely my day, my personal life has spent, a lot of my time is spent just catching up and calling people and just seeing how folks are talking to my family for so many hours at this point, day to day. And then with my fiance, I mean, we don't really, typically we would, go out to the movies or go to a restaurant and eat. And now we might spend it walking around our neighborhood pond, or, just eating dinner and maybe not having the TV on, and just really being present. So in some of those ways, I've, been able to still keep in touch and build those relationships that have kept me, sane through all of this. And definitely just food, making a lot of food.
So at work and at home, how do you think COVID will change your life in the future?
I think at work, there's probably going to be more flexibility, in terms of working remote. Our team was primarily working at the office, so we didn't necessarily have remote work. And so now I think there might be some more flexibility for those that do want to maybe have a hybrid schedule where they're working from home, working, from the office. I think it's probably going to make a lot of us in across sectors think about real estate space and just like how much space you truly need. And I also would say, on a personal note, I think it's made me like reconnect with some friends that I'm, hadn't talked to for a while, but throughout the pandemic would just send them a quick text and be like, how are you doing? How, what? And I think that reconnecting and has been really important. I think there's going to be some implications on what it means to, go shopping and be at restaurants and all of that. I have wondered what it's going to mean for, when I think about the Latino community specifically, I would say that like my family and my culture is very much like, having 10, 15 people over for, and hugging and all of those things that make, my culture so beautiful and so heartwarming, but it probably is going to mean different things now, and folks are maybe not going to be reaching out for a hug as they used to. And so those are things that I'm curious to see how that works. And then more long-term, this is both work and personal, but education. I think the role of schools in the pandemic has been very critical, and I do sometimes wonder on a personal level, like, what does it mean for this generation of students who have now spent, a year, in learning remotely? What is that going to mean for not just the achievement, the achievement gap or the opportunity gap, but what is it also going to mean for the future of curriculum in school, and what that looks like? And related to that, what about childcare? I mean, I think we've realized that certain things that we might have not thought were basic needs are now basic needs, right? Like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is definitely a basic need, right? Like we might have in the past thought it was a luxury, but actually it's not. It is. It's the world we live in, and in some ways the pandemic, I think, has forced us to grapple and really reimagine not only the school setting, the childcare space, but also what is basic needs and what are the the things that in the past we might have not thought were rights, and now we might think of them differently. And so I do think there's some of that might happen.
Has the foundation been involved at all in giving money to families to get Wi-Fi?
So we did have an effort where we worked with the Tulsa Housing Authority to provide mobile hotspots to families who were living in some of these apartment complexes. So we have played a role there. Although I will say, the Tulsa County has approved some of their coronavirus relief fund dollars to go toward supporting those that do not have internet access through affordable internet or mobile hotspots. And so I think that there's been some neat efforts across the city and county and the state, and really the State Department has also really led there in that work. Mm-hmm.
You sound like a long-term Tulsa resident at this point. Do you think you'll stay there?
Oh yeah, I mean, I mentioned I bought my house, which I bought my house like middle of pandemic. I moved, now a couple months ago. Now it's gonna be almost 2 months actually. And I knew before the pandemic that Tulsa was now becoming my home. And I think the pandemic has solidified it. But it also has made me realize, gosh, I really miss my mom and dad and really want to see them and be in California, especially when you're not, traveling. And so, the virtual space has been really critical, I think, to feel connected.
And where does your fiance work?
He works at a dealership here in a nearby city. So he does kind of like more sales work.
So does he see people, and are you worried about him bringing home coronavirus?
Yeah, it's definitely a worry. They're considered an essential business. And so it is a worry. And, he takes as many precautions, and so does the company. So, but, it is always a worry, even when you're just going grocery shopping, right? If we're going to go pick up groceries, just, at this point, we're at a level of community spread where, you just can't really know where you're getting COVID if you do end up testing positive.
Yeah. Do you have I think I'm probably done with my questions, Cynthia. Do you have anything else you want to add? Have I covered like working
I
during
think
the
so. Yeah, I think so.
break?
Yeah. So can you tell me like with the videos, how does it work? Do they like cut certain parts or do they just do like the raw
I
videos
don't
or how does that?
I don't completely know. I know like the blurb I read at the beginning, they keep online, you know, to essentially say that you gave us permission, and there's got to be some editing, you know. I mean, I can't believe that they're going to leave the 15 minutes where we took our break on, but you know, they don't have an unlimited budget either, right? But I think, you know, the whole thing's fascinating because people do reach out, and it's a really important part of history. I mean, think of what you've talked about. I mean, it's so cool, right? So I don't know how long it takes to get uploaded to YouTube or anything like that. Oh, but I do need to talk to you. Can you send me, I'll send you a blurb, but we'd love to get photos of you, your family, things at work about COVID, you know, even slap on a scanner or take a picture with your phone of, you know, things that you've sent out for your clients, you know, just about anything like that, because we upload them and then, you know, like it could be a story, it could be part of a whole thing about what nonprofits do during COVID. Do you know what I'm saying? I'll send you an email with the parameters for photos, but you know, everything from like a picture of your college diploma to you and your childhood friends, anything we've talked about, because it
Okay.
has so much that, I mean, think Ken Burns, think about how Ken Burns gets his pictures, right? I mean, the most ordinary everyday things can be really important.
Okay.
Okay,
I will do that.
appreciate it. Have a great
Cool.
night. I think we're like finishing within 3 hours.
Oh, I know. I'm so sorry. It's taken
No, what are you apologizing for? It was great. I think we did awesome. And I hope you feel like you've said everything. If you don't, you know, let me know, okay?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.